Please have your Bibles open to John chapter 6, 1 to 15. Leah's coming to read it. So John chapter 6, 1 to 15.
Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in the place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself.
Do you recognise that sign? No. First McDonald's opened in 1940, and I was doing a bit of research online. Don't ask me why. Don't ask me. So I was doing a little bit of research, actually about signs. And I discovered that McDonald's have over 44,000 restaurants in the world. 44,000 restaurants, and they are the largest retail property owners in the world. And I was reading a little bit more, and one side said this: "Is there anything more universal than Macca's?" And this is their answer: no. The Golden Arches are the most recognised symbol in the world. The restaurant provides food for people in over 100 countries. Isn't that amazing? Over 100 countries, McDonald's. I haven't been overseas much, so I'd imagine what would be the furthest places or the far out places Macca's would open. You know, some amazing stuff. You see them even on army bases, they have McDonald's. So everywhere you go, you pretty much know what McDonald's stand for: cheap food. Well, it's not cheap these days. No, it's not cheap. It used to be cheap years ago, but and is it real meat? Anyway. But one of the most famous eating places in the whole world actually served only one meal. It said that they served 5,000 men, not counting the women and the children, in one setting. Now that's a restaurant. How would you cater for about 8,000 people? Goodness gracious me. And it took place on an isolated hillside just off the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And you know what was even more amazing? It didn't cost the families 1 cent, or a denarii or a drachma or whatever the currency was of the day. So John's gospel that we've been looking at, it's full of signs. Not signs on posts, but in the form of Jesus' actions and Jesus' words. And what John doesn't do, he doesn't use the language of miracles or wonders. The reason he doesn't do that is because he wants us to understand that these things point beyond themselves. They are signs of God's kingdom. So it's just as important that we pay attention to them. So it's important that we pay attention to them and that we properly have an understanding of them. Now, as we pick up the story here in John chapter 6, we read that the crowds are following Jesus. Why? On the account of why? What's he done? On the account of signs. So they're following Jesus because of the account of signs. The words that John uses are continuous. They kept following because they kept seeing amazing things that Jesus was doing, and he kept on doing. In verse 2, John specifies it's on account of these signs that Jesus was doing for the sick. So it was account of the signs he was doing for the sick. In chapter 4, what does he do there? We learnt about this a little while ago. He healed Daryl had pictures up on the screen last week, a royal official's son. In chapter 5, when he was back in Jerusalem, he healed a man who had been sick just a little bit over 38 years. And as incredible as all of these seem, they mightn't warrant a huge crowd following Jesus in the wilderness. So we've got this big crowd here. But John writes at the end of the gospel, this is what he wrote in chapter 20, verse 30. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Isn't that amazing? How many signs, miracles, wonders did he do? So what John does in his book, he just picks the highlights out. So he's got like a highlight reel. The two healing signs that are in chapter 4 and 5 are just a small sample of the incredible thing that Jesus had been doing for the sick. And it was because of these signs that the crowd were following Jesus. Now, sometime after this, Jesus takes these disciples off to the Sea of Galilee. It's an area where many of them would have been familiar with. So a lot of them are familiar with. So Jesus takes them on up one of the mountainsides, and he sits down with them. And now in the other Gospels, when we read the other Gospel, we read that Jesus took them there to escape from the crowds. They needed to be debriefed. They needed that time to be away. They needed that time to a little bit of rest and recreation. But no sooner had Jesus sat down with his disciples, what happens? He looks and he sees this huge crowd had been following him. Now, in Mark's account, we're told that Jesus saw the crowds were like sheep without a shepherd. And it said that he had compassion on them. And he began to teach them. And he began to teach them many things. And John tells us that Jesus' compassion was also for their immediate physical needs. Yes, it was spiritual. So he looks at the crowd, and even while they're still gathering, people are still coming, he turns to Philip and he asks Philip, where are we going to buy bread for these people to eat? Of the 12 disciples, Philip's the natural one to ask. He hails from that city. So he hails from there. And if any of the disciples had any knowledge of where to get food for the crowd, it would be Philip. Why? Philip was also a bean counter, a numbers man. So according to Philip's calculator, there wasn't enough money to buy the food that these people could eat. 400 denarii is more than a year's wage. Now, John's like someone who's telling a story who can't help dropping hints of what's about to happen. Have you ever just about to go to see a movie and somebody's already seen the movie and they tell you the whole plot? Is that frustrating? Yes, it is frustrating. And John's that type of person. John's giving it away. And what a blessing is that he gives it away. And he wants us to be really clear in verse 6 that Jesus already knew the answer to that question. And we're reminded in Matthew chapter 6, verse 8, that God knows our needs even before we ask him. That's an amazing God. Jesus is aware of our needs. He understands it. John came and prayed for all of these things. God already knows them. He's aware of those needs. And you know what? God is more than capable in meeting those needs, even before we even know what they are. So even before the crowds had gathered, before the question of food ever came up, Jesus was aware of the needs of the crowd. Jesus already knew what he was going to do. But he asked that question to test the disciples, to see how far they had come in their faith and how far that they would understand. It was a test and they didn't do well. Philip is stumped. He can only think of an immediate, economic solution. It would take 8 months' wages, 200 denarii, about $40,000 in today's money, to just buy bread alone. Even if they could find a baker who could do that. That's a lot of money. But that money would only buy a tiny morsel for all of those people there. So you've got to think about it. The situation is impossible. There's no way it can be done. So while Philip's doing his math here, Andrew is hunting for a solution. But Andrew's contribution is fairly pathetic. A child's lunch, 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. He's managed to find a young boy, the only one who had the foresight to pack a lunch. Now, in my tiny brain, I think to myself, you know, what must have been like for this little boy when he got up in the morning? And I really think he wasn't planning on going to see this. I reckon he was going to go out with his mates. He was going to go out with his friends. He was going to spend a little bit of time with them fishing or playing or doing whatever. And a typically good Jewish mum has yelled out, "Boy, you have lunch?" No. So mum's packed himself a little bit of lunch, given it to the boy. So the boy's off to see his mates. He sees a large crowd gathering and he says, "Oh, what's going on here?" So he starts to follow the crowd. And he's asking people, "What's going on?" And they say, see that person up there? That's Jesus of Nazareth." And the boy's thinking, "Oh." And they're saying to him, "Look, he's an incredible teacher. He can heal people. And we all want to hear him. So why don't you come along?" So intrigued, the young boys followed him. He forgets about his mates and he wants to listen to this guy. He becomes enthralled with the teaching about the kingdom of God, about love and forgiveness. And he can hardly contain himself. You know, the stories he'd heard people talking about Jesus making blind people see, lame walk. And he ends up spending the whole day listening to Jesus. And when Jesus retreats, he joins the crowd and he follows. Now, John makes mention here of these barley loaves. And we might think it's a pretty good meal, a nice little picnic little boys had with him. When you think of barley loaves in today's society, what do you think of? a nice little artisan loaf. In fact, if you went to a hipster bread shop, it would cost you $8 a kilo of barley flour to make a hipster barley loaf. But in Jesus' day, barley was cheaper than wheat, so barley loaves were the food of the poor. What's more, it wouldn't have been loaves. So when you think about it, it would be like small little rolls that this boy had. So he's got a couple of little rolls. And it wouldn't be a nice piece of salmon. It would be like these small little pickled fish. Kind of like a sardine, I guess. What are the English versions? Pilchards. Pilchards. Nice. This isn't a nice picnic lunch. It's basic. It's a meagre meal. It's more like a fish sandwich. It's a pauper's meal. Just remember that. It is a pauper's meal. But one that the boy and many people would have been familiar with. This particular place, it wasn't a rich region. They had simple, basic food. That's all they had, just a simple, basic food. So it's getting late in the day. And as they stand in a large group in front of Jesus, the disciples start walking through the crowd. So the disciples are walking through the crowd. The boy feels a tug on his arm. He turns around and he hears Andrew. Hey, what do you got there? Oh, nothing. Oh, come here, let me see. Andrew grabs the boy's lunchbox. After looking inside it, he says, come with me. Would you come with him? Somebody's just knocked off your lunch. Think about the amazing miracle here. You see some of our kids today. You try to take somebody's lunchbox, you've got to cop one. That's a difference. So Andrew brings his poor boy with small, simple food forward, knowing it's not going to go far. It's barely enough to feed a little child, let alone the disciples. Forget about the crowd of 5,000, 8,000, 10,000, whatever it was. So Andrew's driving home Philip's point here. So he gets the boy. There is no way that this boy could feed all these people. It is laughable. But do you know what I love about Jesus? He's undeterred. He doesn't laugh. He tells the disciples to get the crowd to go and sit on the green grass. And then simply, without pausing, without any concern, Jesus takes what little they have and gives thanks for it. John doesn't record the words of what Jesus actually said, but I guess it would have been some sort of a traditional Jewish blessing, something like, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." Then he starts handing the bread and the fish out, and keeps handing the bread and the fish out, and keeps handing the bread and the fish out. Everybody gets something to eat. Amazingly, the food doesn't run out. The crowd's fed. They're fed more than just a meagre portion. They eat until they are full. As much as they wanted, they ate. They're full to the gills. Sorry about that, had to throw that in. They ate so much. But what? Guess there's leftovers. Now, although the food here was miraculously provided, come from nowhere, it costs nothing, Jesus doesn't let it get treated lightly. He commands that he doesn't want to let good food go to waste. He commands it to be collected. 200 denarii wouldn't have given the people more than a mouthful to eat. But from the fragments of 5 barley loaves from nothing, what's left after 5 or 10,000 people have eaten an enormous 12 baskets? The 12 baskets, when you look at it, they could be symbolic of the 12 tribes, the sign of the new kingdom, but it also could be that there's just one basket for each of the disciples. It's an amazing sign of God's compassion, provision for his people. Although the fare is somewhat plainer, it's like the sign of the water turned into wine back in chapter 2. It's an image of the feast that awaits God's people in the kingdom, in his kingdom. But there's more to this sign. I want you to think about this, with such a large crowd, it's unlikely that everybody or everyone saw or heard what Jesus had done. But what happens in a large crowd? Word travels quickly. You got 5,000. We got, about 100 bappos here. If something said it'll spread like wildfire before the service is over. This is spreading. Word travelling fast. And you can imagine what they ate. That as they ate, the people started talking about what happened. They knew that something amazing had happened. Where did all this bread come from? They knew that this was a sign. They understood what it pointed to. John gives us some clues. He gives us some clues here to help us understand what the significance of that sign. Back in verse 4, have a look at verse 4. He makes what it appears to be a throwaway line here. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. The fact that it was near the time of Passover, when many Jews would be travelling to Jerusalem, it just doesn't just help explain why there's such a large crowd wandering in the wilderness, okay? So think about that. It helps us to understand what the sign is pointing to. The Passover festival was a big Jewish festival. It was a celebration, a memorial of God's amazing deliverance of his people. It was a time when the Jewish people looked back and they remembered what God had done. He had delivered them from slavery from Egypt. And when they told the old stories about God, about how Moses had led them out of Egypt through the Red Sea and into the wilderness, when they also remembered God's provision for them wandering in the wilderness, how he gave them manna that was bread from heaven came down. But the Passover wasn't a time for looking back and remembering. It was also a time for looking forward. They would have remembered the promise God delivered through Moses in the wilderness. In Deuteronomy, chapters 18, 15 to 19, the Lord our God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. Can you imagine the crowd chewing over this in their mind? As they're chewing on the Sea of Galilee, can you imagine them making all these connections? So the people are making all these connections, are coming together. They're starting to interpret the signs themselves. They begin to think, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Their expectations, their hopes are high. They're heading into Passover, so they're high. Here is the one that Moses had promised, one who would follow in Moses' footsteps, who would deliver God's people again. These expectations were so conflated with the hopes for the Messiah, a king of David's line. All of these hopes were turbocharged around the time of the Passover. And that is what we call national pride, Jewish national pride. It's like Australia Day. Well, Australia Day was, but it's more like Anzac Day. Australia Day should be national pride. Get together tomorrow, proud of our nation. The air is charged with electricity. There's an expectation and there's energy going on. These recent signs is just a spark that needs for the crowd to get excited. So this crowd is getting excited. Just think about it, 5,000 Jewish men that John mentions here. That would make a sizable guerrilla army. Okay. They're ready to snatch Jesus, literally to violently seize him and make him king. They're ready for him to ride point, to ride shotgun as they're going to march into Jerusalem. Throw out these Herodian pretenders to the throne and drive out these Roman infidels. Get rid of them. Of course, we'd never seek to manipulate Jesus like that, hey? We'd never squeeze him into our little box. We'd never try to make him a king in our own image, would we? No. The crowds only got the sign half right. Jesus had come to be king, to deliver his people. But he came to bring an even greater deliverance than Moses. He didn't come to physically deliver one nation at a time. He came to offer an eternal deliverance for all people, all time. He's not about to allow the crowd to manipulate him, to force him to do something that they want to do and he doesn't want to do. Instead, what he does, he quickly sends his disciples off so they wouldn't be caught up in the crowd of this wild frenzy. And after all, Jesus knows what the other disciples are like. They are prone to arguing. They are prone to finding out who's the greatest. They're prone to fall into temptation. So rather than having them jumping into a bandwagon, because they would. Could you imagine Judas jumping onto that bandwagon? Yeah, come on, guys, let's go. Let's grab Jesus and let's go in and take him, 5,000 of us. What Jesus does, he retreats to be alone on the mountain, presumably in prayer to the Father. And we've seen Jesus' great compassion for the needs of the people. And Jesus is the King who provides bread for his people, who knows the needs of the world. And what he does, he calls us to join in meeting those needs. You know, if they had their way, the disciples would have turned the crowds away to fend for themselves. He would have said, get out. 5,000, go, do whatever you want. But Jesus calls us not to shy away from the needs of those around us. He didn't expect the disciples to solve the problems of the world. He doesn't expect us to single-handedly solve world hunger. We've got a crisis going on. Instead, what he does, he invites us to offer what we have. He promises to take what we offer in faith. It's exactly what we do when we tithe. We put a little bit and he takes it and he accepts it. And to trust him to use it to achieve great things. The boy only had a few pieces of bread, couple of fish, but barley loaves and pickled fish is a meal that, if you think about it, it's not even hardly fit for a king. But Jesus didn't turn it away. Jesus ate it. And you know what he did? He turned the world upside down. He didn't come to be a king the way that the people there might have expected, the way society expects it. He is the king who's come to offer people eternal deliverance. And he challenges us to accept him. If we try to seek control, to shape Jesus in our own image, to make what we find comfortable, we're likely to find that he's going to slip away just like he did with those guys. So bless you guys. We're going to sing one more song and then we'll go and have some morning tea.